This episode of Wheat Pete's Word is brought to you by Syngenta. Stack the deck in your favor in 2025 with a stacked cereals lineup of crop protection products from Syngenta. With proven technology for exceptional disease control and greater plant resilience, you'll find game-changing solutions for your wheat crop. Visit syngenta.ca for more info.
Good day and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, April the 9th. On this episode of the Word, it's winter again. What's going on? Oh gosh, the erosion. Couple of fun facts and then Agronomy answers what Paul likes best. Let's go! Yes, the weather has just gone negative on us. It's like winter has returned. I can't tell you how many people I have talked to that just shake their head and say, what? Snow in April? It's not supposed to happen in Ontario anymore. I don't know. Last winter, we didn't have a winter. This winter, it's just we're making up for it. Remember, Mother Nature loves averages, or maybe actually humans love averages. But as my good friend Nature Nut Nick has always said, you put your head in the freezer, your feet in the oven, on average you're comfortable. And you're not, it's not comfortable. But that's the way averages work, and that's just what we're working out to. And then last Wednesday, after I got the word done, oh my gosh, that night came in just a horrendous rainstorm. Here at Ingersoll, where I live, from about, I think, 1 a.m. till 2:30 a.m., the downpour was torrential. That's when all the ice storm went through in the rest of Ontario. But it's really interesting, that ice storm. Donald at Udney leaving me a voicemail message saying, Peter, we had no power for 1 week. But you don't have to go very far north, and there wasn't ice. You don't have to go very far south, and there wasn't ice. But man, where they got the freezing rain, it was horrendous. Here we got about 2.5 inches. My farm got 3 inches in that one rainstorm. And gosh, the erosion that caused. And remember, 80% of the erosion happens in the non-growing season. Why do we get the erosion when we get that 3-inch rainstorm in April? Because unless you're growing the crop of all crops, winter wheat, we have not enough soil cover. And so we can manage erosion. Just a great picture from Brent. He sent me a picture and said, thank goodness for the wheat. Brent, by the way, Brent farms on pretty hilly dirt, like really hilly dirt. And the wheat stubble and the cover crop planted that was burned down last fall, but the residue was there. All of that just saved that farm from huge gullies washing through it. We can manage that. It just that not all of us do, and the driving around, the amount of erosion really is quite horrendous. By the way, we think it's bad here. One grower saying 3 feet of topsoil moved, and it now covers the catch basin that was supposed to take the water away. That's a lot of dirt moving, a lot of soil movement, and it's the best soil often that moves as well. But hey, Kentucky, over the last 3 or 4 days, last weekend I believe it was, got 8 inches of rain over a 3 or 4 day period. That's got to be even worse than the 3 inches we got. Of course, they have their crop planted. They do have some soil coverage, and that absolutely helps. But from that perspective, Ron's sending me a great bunch of emails about grassed waterways and how frustrated he is that grassed waterways that were put in place 30 years ago, simply, some of them have been taken out, and where they're taken out, the gullies are just forming where they haven't been maintained. And this is one of the keys. Grassed waterways don't last forever. And if you think about it, the old fence row, You walk into the old fence row, and it's always higher in the old fence row than it is out in the field. And part of that is tillage, but part of that is just that the roots from that fence row or the roots in the grassed waterway, they are always adding organic matter. They're adding air to the soil. They're loosening it up. It's less compacted most of the time. And so eventually it kind of raises up a little bit beside the field that you're working. And once that happens, if the water starts to track beside the grassed waterway, guess what? It's almost worse than not having a grassed waterway. So Dr. Dave last summer did exactly what he needed to do, had a grassed waterway. It was getting to be that it was higher than the field beside. He redid the grassed waterway. And as Ron says, it takes an hour with the bulldozer and some grass seed, and you can reshape that grassed waterway, make it work again. And Dr. Dave, if you're listening, I'm really anxious to know, with that last big rainstorm, was the grass in the grassed waterway established enough that it didn't create a problem? And therein lies the challenge, right? It's never easy to do all those things. Hey, a couple of other cool things as I move on. The fusarium head blight pressure in Texas right now, the map is solid red. The wheat in Texas is actually in the stage where it's at risk from fusarium head blight. So that's wow. They mostly don't get it in Texas because they're too hot, but right now it looks like the risk is quite high. And we had that little discussion about the tile from Jason up in the Peace River District. Ben, a great agronomist up in Northern Ontario, says, hey, Peter, come on. Cochrane has been using tile drainage for decades. It works like magic. It makes farms actually farmable. And if you can imagine, Cochrane has a shorter season than Fort Vermilion in the Peace River District, which is getting up to the north part of the Peace. And so I did not realize this, that the soils that we farm in Northern Ontario, some of them are actually shorter season. The winters, because Ben went back and looked, the winters are not quite as cold as the winters in the Peace River District, but almost within 1 degree Celsius. The summers are cooler and shorter, and so Northern Ontario and the Peace River District are just about the same, even though from a latitude standpoint, the Peace River District is quite a bit further north, and you kind of shake your head and say, why is that? And Ben just fires back with, come on, it's that ice cube called James Bay that just makes us so cool. So, yes, tile does work. The bottom line out of this is that I didn't know that Northern Ontario was that short a season. I knew it was short season, but man, it's worse than I thought, or shorter than I thought, I guess, and that tile drainage still absolutely works. Hey, here's one other cool thing that I learned that I did not know, and all the Western listeners are just going to say, Johnson, where have you been that you did not know this? But Western Canada moves a ton of grain by rail. That's how they get it to port. And I did not know, but in February, the amount of grain movement by rail dropped dramatically. And that's because when it hits minus 25 degrees Celsius, they have to shorten up the unit trains because of the challenges at that cold a temperature. So they can't move as much grain when it's below minus 25 Celsius. And they had a full, I believe, 3 weeks. It was something like February 1st or 2nd all the way to the 19th. I guess that's not quite full 3 weeks, but that entire time frame, they kept moving grain, but they had to do it with much shorter trains, and that has a big impact on the amount of grain that they can actually move. Just, I don't know, I think that kind of stuff's cool. All right, let's go. Let's get to Paul's agronomy answers. First up, Dave saying, Peter, we broadcast red clover. I couldn't believe it. I was out, I think about 3 weeks ago or a month ago, we broadcast it. I'm out looking at it. Some of that red clover has already germinated. With these cold temperatures, is it going to be okay? And Dave, the answer is that red clover, quite an interesting crop. Until it hits the first trifoliate stage, It maintains incredible cold tolerance. Oh, not as much cold tolerance as if it didn't germinate, because if it's a hard, dry seed, it'll take take super cold temperatures. But once it imbibes it and starts that germination process, or even just once it imbibes, it does start to grow, even though you don't see that. But it will take at least -9 to take that red clover out. And if it gets a little bit of snow like it did on it, it's going to be 100% fine. By the way, wheat, once it breaks dormancy, it's also about -9 before it runs into trouble. The only difference there, the red clover's on top of the soil surface. The wheat growing point is 3/4 of an inch to an inch in the ground, so it would be that much more protected. But yeah, until first trifoliate, even like at cotyledon stage, at unifoliate stage, red clover and alfalfa both maintain very, very good cold tolerance. It's not till they hit that first trifoliate stage. Gord saying, hey, Peter, okay, so we're going to go out, we're going to put our sulphate sulfur on sandy soil. How far does it move with rain? Because we know nitrate moves, and how does that relate? It's an awesome question, Gord. And Luke Gatabani did a super presentation at one of the ag conferences. I think it was in 2021 or 2022. And sulfur, even though it's sulfate, SO4, and it's negatively charged, whereas nitrate is NO3, negatively charged, nitrate moves far more readily, far more rapidly through the soil than sulfur does. And in fact, Dan Kaiser out of Minnesota just had a paper out, or an article out, and they have been doing sulfur trials in Minnesota. And what's amazing is that when they put sulphate sulfur on a field of, say, corn, they can see sulphate or sulfur benefits on that strip for not just the next year, but actually for 2 full years, they can see the benefit of that additional sulfur in the subsequent crops, which tells you, now, of course, Minnesota's not as wet as Ontario, but it's not as dry as North Dakota or as Saskatchewan. It's more like Manitoba, so they do get a fair bit of rain, particularly in the Red River Valley through Minnesota. So sulfur hangs around much better, even in the sulfate form, than the nitrate does, and it's just part of that whole thought process. So nitrogen in sandy soil, we typically say that if that sandy soil is totally saturated, that another inch of rain would take nitrate nitrogen 6 inches deep. So you get 4 inches of rain, it's down 2 feet, and you say, oh, it's gone. Well, actually it's not, because the nitrogen moves with the water. As that soil dries out, the nitrogen comes back up with water as it moves towards the surface. So we don't lose it as much as we think in the growing season, because the general water movement isn't down, it's up, or it's down and up again as the crop pulls that out. With sulfur, I don't know what the exact number is, but it probably is at most half of what the nitrate is. And what's really interesting is if you go back when Shane and I were doing the initial sulfur on wheat trials that we did from 2011 to 2013, when we first found sulfur deficiency in 2010, then we started the trials in 2011, we did a site on sandy soil near Aylmer where we saw great response to sulfur on wheat. Now, this is a sandy soil in Ontario. The next year, the grower grew soybeans on that field, and they actually called us because they could pick out every sulfur treatment from our winter wheat trials the year before in that soybean crop, and the soybeans just did grow far better in that particular situation. So, yep, sulfur hangs around. If you apply it in the spring, I am not worried about it moving out of the wheat rooting zone or the soil profile at all. I still am not convinced about fall sulphate sulfur applications. We have not seen a benefit there, but maybe things have changed and we need to relook at that data. Mike saying, hey Peter, okay, this data from Sean Castile, where we saw if you applied sulfur with a rye cover crop, that the soybeans did not suffer any yield loss from the rye cover crop. It's as if the rye cover crop was tying the sulfur up, and because it tied the sulfur up, that's why we got a yield drag to cover crop rye ahead of soybeans. What about corn? Would it work the same way? And Mike, I think the answer is no, and here's why. In the soybean example, the problem is that the rhizobia that we need to nodulate on that soybean crop, and early, because by the time we hit V6, I believe it is, that no more nodulation. We're just done. So that nodulation has to happen early. The rye has taken up all the sulphate sulfur, no sulphate sulfur for the soybean rhizobium unless we apply more, so we don't get nodulation. We don't get nodulation, we get less yield. Corn doesn't nodulate, and corn's sulfur demand is not very high in the early growth stages. In the work that Shalimar Armstrong did, it was pretty clear that if you're going to grow corn following cover crop rye, even cover crop rye that does not get very big, you need an additional 50 pounds of nitrogen, and that's to overcome the allelopathic effect. The soybean crop, it doesn't really get impacted a lot by allelopathy, but if it's short sulfur, it gets impacted. The corn crop, it's more allelopathy, and it's just not a sulfur demand thing, so try it. But I just don't think that the sulfur on corn following a cereal rye cover crop is going to help you. Hey, Scott, on light soils, Scott's saying, Peter, I'm going to put some quite sandy soils, horse data suggesting we need sulfur. I'm going to go out there and put my ammonium sulfate on. How early can I do that? Can I get it done in early April, in mid-April, so that it's out of the way? It's just one of those jobs that I'm done. And this whole discussion, Scott says, yep, in Sean Castile's data, they did it 2 weeks before they planted the soybeans, saw perfect results, didn't see any issue whatsoever. And as you think through this sulfur movement in the soil that we've been talking about here for long enough, just get that job done. I just think it's not going to be a problem. Okay, going to move on. Chris saying, Peter, every time I hear a seed salesman talk, they say, make sure, Mr. Farmer, make sure that you grow the right variety for your environment. And then that's the end of the conversation. They don't say, so, this is the characteristic you need to look for. This, and it just stops. And Chris is saying, so I look at their seed guide. What do I need to look for? What matters? And his example, do I just look for drought tolerance because I'm on a sand soil? What do I look if I'm on a clay soil? So, Chris, I really think it's a great suggestion, a great topic. I really want Lindsay to do an agronomist on this because I really think you've hit on an awesome idea. But you're right. So if you are growing corn on a sandy soil or crops on a sandy soil, that the number one issue is drought, you almost always have drought issues, then look for drought tolerance. If, on the other hand, you're farming on a heavy clay soil and you're growing corn, man, the number one thing you probably have to worry about is how good is the root system, because we know that on heavy clay soils we get less root growth. If we want to have big yields, we need a good root system to access water, to access nutrients. So I think you look for roots. But what I really think is that you have to step back as a grower and ask yourself, so on this farm or on my farm, what is the attribute of that crop that makes the most or means the most to my final outcome? And in many cases, it will be different for different farms, different farmers. If you're a no-till farmer, I think you have to look at emergence scores, early seedling vigor, because the soil's going to be less conducive to that early growth period. And you have to ask yourself that question and then figure out what those parameters are. But Chris, an awesome comment and a great idea for us here at Real Agriculture. All right, let's finish today's episode with winter canola. Megan Moran out scouting. I was with her. It's such an interesting crop. So first off, as you scout your canola, man, I was astounded scouting canola, digging plants. The plants looked perfectly healthy on the soil surface. They were the right height. You would say, gosh, that's awesome. and you would take your spade or your trowel and you would dig that plant out, and it's on a clay soil that tends to sit wet. And gosh, the top inch or so of the root was fine, and below that, the root was mush. And you go, okay, so that's not as healthy as we expected. You dig up the plant right beside it, it would be 100% fine. And so as you scout winter canola, there's so many different things that are out there. It's a crop I think we have to learn more about. And so from that perspective, when you're finding damaged roots, but the plant is still alive and probably can make roots above the mushy root, it's got some yield potential, I really think you step back and say, okay, this field may not or does not have as much yield potential as it could have, so maybe we reduce the nitrogen rate. And what's interesting is that in the data that I believe Eric Page at AAFC at Harrow has generated, winter canola looks awfully similar to corn in that you can reduce your nitrogen application by 30 pounds, and as long as you're within 30 pounds of the optimum rate, you're within that $10 of maximum economics. And so where you look at these fields and they're marginal, I think it makes perfect sense to pull your nitrogen rate back to 100 or 120 pounds of nitrogen, and you're not going to likely hurt yield the way that you would expect to. On the other hand, you have a good field, man. Canola, it loves sulfur, it loves nitrogen. The other really interesting thing, little wee plants that last fall because they got planted into dry soil, it stayed dry, they didn't get rainfall till, I don't know, October sometime. They had 4 leaves, just 4 leaves, and I don't know, the root is the thickness of the lead in your pencil, not the thickness of your thumb, which is what you want. Those plants in many cases survived, and you just go, wow, how can that be? The other thing that Megan found out there, and we're going to have to follow this one through, we have talked lots about herbicide carryover, and even herbicide carryover from the soybean crop. So we grow soybeans, we apply herbicides there, we grow winter wheat after the soybeans, so we're getting to be a year away before we plant winter canola after the winter wheat. Those soybean herbicides can still have an impact. We have one field where we suspect metribuzin damage. We're not positive yet, but that's coming from that soybean crop. So lots of things to look at. By the way, one other field, the winter canola looked awful. It was brown. You just go, oh my gosh, it's just like, is this even okay? You dug the roots, they were fine. All the growing points were starting to grow, and you just say, okay, so it can look like heck first thing in the spring, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's when it yields absolutely the most. With that, that's it. That's all on behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture. This is Wheat Beat with one long episode of The Word. Hey, keep the comments, the feedback coming. We love it here, and we will talk to you too long again next week. See you then.